London, 1817. The air was heavy with perfume, candlelight, and the rustle of silk, that peculiar hum of high society before a scandal breaks. Beneath the chandeliers of the Harcourt ballroom, Lady Amelia stood at the center of what was meant to be her triumph. Her gown was the soft blush of spring roses, her eyes calm though her heart trembled like a trapped bird. Tonight was to mark her formal betrothal to Lord Thomas Pembroke, heir to the Duke of Keswick. Guests spoke her name with envy, until the music faltered and silence, thick and electric, fell across the golden hall. Thomas stepped forward. His cravat gleamed white against his dark coat, his expression was composed, almost courteous. Yet his words carried the chill of a blade. "My engagement to Lady Amelia Harcourt," he said, loud enough for every ear to hear, "is no longer tenable. I find her conduct unbefitting a woman of her station." There was a ripple, a gasp, the sound of lace fans snapping open like defensive wings. Amelia felt the blood drain from her face, the world narrowing into the cold gleam of chandeliers above. "My lord," she managed, her voice soft but steady, "what conduct do you mean?" He met her eyes, and in that instant she saw no affection, only calculation. "A letter," he said simply, "from you to another man." It was rather intimate. The crowd stirred, whispers swelling like a tide. Amelia's father, the Viscount of Eastmere, stood frozen, mortified, unable to intervene. "That letter is false," Amelia said, her composure cracking just enough for pain to show. "I never wrote it." Her words vanished into the hum of gossip. The violinists lowered their bows, someone laughed softly, the cruel kind of laugh that ends reputations. Thomas gave a slight bow, murmured, "I wish you well," and turned away, leaving her standing alone under the light that once made her radiant. By morning, every drawing-room in London spoke of the fallen Harcourt girl. The story grew with every retelling. The mysterious officer in Spain, the supposed secret correspondence, the desperate pleas of a woman now unfit for marriage. No one cared for the truth, only for the thrill of scandal. Amelia did not weep where others could see. She thanked the servants who avoided her eyes, she accepted her father's silence, and when he said quietly that she must retire to the countryside, until the matter is forgotten, she nodded without protest. The carriage that took her from London rolled through rain-slicked streets, past carriages of the very people who had toasted her days before. Behind every curtain, she imagined faces watching her go, their pity sharper than scorn. Wiltshire was quiet, too quiet. The Harcourt estate there was old and sprawling, its corridors filled with the ghosts of better times. Amelia spent her days among books and long walks through misty gardens, her once vibrant spirit pressed beneath the weight of isolation. She wrote in her journal but never about Thomas, never about that night. Instead, she wrote of small things, the scent of lavender after rain, the way the light turned silver on the lake at dusk. Sometimes, when she caught her reflection in the glass, she almost did not recognize herself. Society had taken her name and twisted it, she would not let it take her dignity too. Her father's letters were polite, distant, filled with hollow reassurances about time-healing wounds. None mentioned that his political allies had turned cold, that her disgrace had rippled through the family's fortunes. One afternoon, Amelia overheard the servants whispering that Lord Pembroke's engagement to Lady Cassandra, a marquis's daughter, had been announced. Proof that her humiliation had only ever been convenience for him. She felt no anger, only a strange, steady quiet inside her chest, as though grief had burned itself out. Autumn came early that year. The leaves outside turned to copper, the air smelled of smoke and distance. It was during one of her walks, long, lonely paths bordered by crumbling stone walls, that she first heard the name Winthorpe. The local vicar, a kindly man who often brought news from the neighboring parishes, spoke of the Duke of Winthorpe in hushed tones, a man who had once commanded troops in the Peninsula Wars, who had returned with scars that never quite healed, whose wife had died 2 winters past. His estate, he said, was vast but desolate, its master, reclusive and haunted. "He's seen too much death," the vicar murmured. "And too much pity." The name lingered with her for reasons she could not explain. Perhaps it was because, like her, the Duke had been broken by circumstance and left to the mercy of whispers. She began to imagine what kind of man he must be. Someone who understood silence, who did not shrink from disgrace but endured it. Yet she dismissed the thought quickly. Men like him did not concern themselves with women like her. The days slipped into weeks. On the eve of the first frost, a carriage approached the Harcourt gates. Its livery was unfamiliar, its crest strange. A footman in dark green delivered a letter sealed with black wax. Amelia turned it over in her hands. The mark was unmistakable, the Winthorpe crest. Inside, written in a steady, precise hand, were these words: "Your Ladyship, I have learned of your recent misfortune through channels both formal and otherwise. Forgive the intrusion, but I believe we may be of service to one another. Circumstance has rendered both our names subject to cruel interpretation. I propose an arrangement, not of affection, but of understanding. Should this prospect interest you, I invite you to Winthorpe Hall within the fortnight. N. Winthorpe." She read it twice, then a third time, her heart stirring with something she had not felt in months. Not joy, but curiosity. The ink was bold, the tone devoid of pity. Here was a man who did not flinch from scandal, who spoke plainly of it. Her father, upon hearing of the letter, frowned and muttered that it would be unwise to entertain another alliance so soon. Yet his objections were thin. There was no other path left for her, no other door open in London or the countryside. That night, as she sat by the window with a letter in her lap, the firelight traced her profile, a woman marked by shame yet still unbroken. The rain fell steadily against the glass, and for the first time since her exile, Amelia allowed herself to wonder if disgrace might not be the end of her story, but the beginning of something else. The clock struck midnight. She sealed her reply with trembling fingers and a whisper only the dark could hear. "Yes, Your Grace. I will come." The morning she left for Winthorpe was silver with fog. The carriage wheels groaned through damp earth, the sound of distant crows breaking the silence that hung like breath before confession. Amelia sat motionless within, gloved hands clasped in her lap, the Duke's letter folded once more beside her. Each mile drew her further from disgrace, yet not closer to safety. Her reflection in the window looked calm, but her pulse betrayed her, a faint, trembling rhythm of uncertainty. When at last the carriage turned through the iron gates of Winthorpe Hall, she saw what isolation looked like in stone. The manor rose from the mist like something half-remembered from a dream. Vast, proud, but weary. Its windows were dark, its gardens untended, ivy creeping like green sorrow over the marble walls. The butler who greeted her bowed deeply, his expression unreadable. "His Grace awaits you in the west drawing-room," he said, voice low as if the house itself demanded quiet. She followed, her footsteps echoing through endless corridors lined with portraits, dukes and duchesses of centuries past, painted faces gazing down as though judging the newcomer. At the end of the hall, a tall figure stood by the fire. The Duke of Winthorpe did not turn immediately, he seemed carved into stillness. When he did, Amelia caught her breath. He was not old, perhaps in his early 30s, but war had left its signatures. A faint scar traced his jaw, another near his temple. His gaze was sharp yet oddly gentle, the kind of gaze that measured not to wound but to understand. "Lady Amelia," he said, inclining his head, "you are most punctual." His voice was low, steady, neither welcoming nor cold. She curtsied, answering with quiet composure, "Your Grace, I thank you for receiving me." He gestured to the chair opposite the fire. They sat in silence for a moment, the clock ticking like a heartbeat between them. Finally, he said, "You know why I wrote to you. My name, though once respected, is now subject to whispers. They say I am mad, or worse, cursed by the memory of my late wife. I wish neither to confirm nor deny their cruelty. I merely wish to live without it." Amelia's eyes lifted to his. "And you believe marriage will grant you that reprieve?" He allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. "Not marriage, my lady, alliance. Respectable companionship. You require a shield, I require peace. Society may mock such unions, but I find honesty preferable to pretense." His words, stark as winter, struck her with unexpected warmth. She had expected arrogance, perhaps pity, not such plain dignity. "If I am to accept," she said softly, "I must ask what it is you expect of me." He studied her face for a long moment. "Composure," he said. "Discretion. A willingness to let the past remain buried." He paused, then added more quietly, "And perhaps kindness, when circumstance permits it." They married 1 week later. The ceremony was held in the chapel adjoining the estate, lit by 2 candles and a November sky that promised snow. No guests, no music, only the vicar, the butler, and the scent of damp stone. When Nathaniel, for that was his Christian name, placed the ring upon her finger, his hand trembled slightly, though his gaze never wavered. Amelia felt something shift between them, a fragile current neither could name. As they left the chapel, he offered his arm, and she took it without hesitation. The days that followed were marked by a kind of poised distance. The Duke kept largely to his study, surrounded by letters and dispatches from former comrades, while Amelia wandered the grounds. The gardens were wild, the fountains dry, but she saw in them a beauty waiting to be reclaimed. She began small restorations, fresh flowers in vases, curtains drawn to let in light, music in the empty music room. The servants, cautious at first, began to soften in her presence. It was as if she breathed life into the hall simply by existing in it. Nathaniel watched her more than he spoke to her. He would find her in the conservatory at dusk, her hair catching the last rays of light as she pruned overgrown roses. "You needn't trouble yourself," he said once, standing in the doorway. "Winthorpe has survived neglect before." Without turning, she replied, "It survived, perhaps. But it forgot how to live." He said nothing, but that night, when she entered the dining hall, she found fresh candles lit and the table set with care. It was the first quiet gesture of companionship between them. Rumors, however, did not rest. A letter arrived from London, laced with venomous curiosity. "The disgraced Harcourt girl has ensnared another title." Amelia read it in silence, then placed it in the fire. Nathaniel entered moments later, and watched the flames consume it. "You needn't burn what cannot hurt you," he said. "It already did," she answered softly. "This is only the burial." Something in her tone silenced him. He poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed her one, a silent truce, sealed in smoke and amber. Over time, their silence grew companionable. One evening, as snow drifted against the windows, Amelia sat at the pianoforte. Her fingers moved hesitantly at first, then with confidence. The melody was soft, melancholic. Nathaniel listened from the doorway, unseen. When the music ceased, she turned and found him there. "Forgive me," she said, startled. "I did not mean to intrude on your solitude." He stepped closer, the firelight catching the silver threads in his dark coat. "You mistake me," he murmured. "It is solitude that intrudes upon me. Your music reminded me that I once had a home." For a moment, words seemed unnecessary. The air between them held something fragile and new. He reached for the fallen sheet of music, handed it back to her, and their fingers brushed. It was the briefest contact, yet it carried more tenderness than any declaration. After that night, he began taking supper with her regularly, their conversations cautious but sincere. She learned he had loved his late wife deeply, but guilt had outlasted grief. He, in turn, learned that Amelia's pride was not armor but a vow, a refusal to be broken by cruelty. Then came the storm. It began with wind that rattled the windows and ended in chaos. A tree crashed against the east wing, shattering glass and flooding the corridor. Amelia, hearing the commotion, ran through the dark halls without hesitation. She found Nathaniel directing servants to safety, his arm bleeding from shattered glass. "You should be upstairs," he called, but she ignored him, tearing strips of her gown to bind his wound. "Do not order me to stand idle, your grace," she said firmly. "I have had enough of silence." For the first time, he smiled, a real, unguarded smile. When the storm subsided, they stood together amid the wreckage, her gown torn and stained crimson. The air smelled of rain and smoke. Nathaniel looked at her, not as the world had, not as scandal, nor as duty, but as something luminous. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. I had forgotten what grace looks like. And in that single moment, she understood that pity had never lived in his eyes, only recognition. Spring returned with quiet insistence, melting the frost that had lingered too long across the moors of Winthorpe. The roses Amelia had planted in the dead of winter began to bloom, their petals opening toward the pale sun as if daring the world to forget despair. Within the hall, warmth had crept back as well, not the kind born of fire or comfort, but the gentler kind that came when two people stopped fearing the sound of their own hearts. The Duke no longer hid in his study, his footsteps mingled with hers in the corridors. Servants began to speak of laughter, subdued, dignified, but real. And though neither Amelia nor Nathaniel spoke of love, its presence lingered in the air between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Her transformation was not sudden but deliberate. Every letter she wrote carried the seal of a duchess now known for compassion. She restored schools on the estate grounds, visited the families of wounded soldiers, and held small gatherings in the restored conservatory that had once stood in ruins. Where once her name had been whispered in derision, it was now murmured with cautious admiration. The scandal that had defined her seemed to dissolve in the rhythm of honest work and unassuming grace. Nathaniel watched her often from the threshold, as though afraid to disturb the peace she had resurrected. One evening, he said quietly, "You have done more for this house than I ever could." Amelia turned to him, her face lit by candlelight. "I have only given it what I needed myself. Forgiveness." But forgiveness in England's high society was a rarer currency. When the first letter arrived from London, an invitation sealed with royal crest, Amelia hesitated to open it. Nathaniel broke the wax for her. "A charity ball," he read, "to honor veterans of the Peninsula Wars. Attendance by the Duchess of Winthorpe is humbly requested." His tone was neutral, but his eyes betrayed memory. It was London that had destroyed her once. It was London that whispered still. "I will not return there," she said softly. "Not to the place that rejoiced in my ruin." He studied her for a moment, then replied, "If you never return, they win twice, once by shame and again by fear." His words lingered through the night like the echo of an oath. The decision came days later, sealed not by pride but resolve. Amelia ordered her emerald gown, the one gifted by Nathaniel, the same color as the necklace he had given her before the storm. It was bold, defiant, the color of life renewed. When the evening of the ball arrived, they traveled to London together, their carriage gliding through familiar streets that had once watched her exile. Amelia's heart thudded beneath her corset, every lantern-lit window a ghost of the night she had fallen. Yet Nathaniel's presence beside her was steadying. He offered his arm as they ascended the steps of the palace ballroom, whispering, "Let them see the woman they tried to bury." The chandeliers burned brighter than she remembered. Every inch of the hall glittered, gold, glass, and curiosity. Conversations faltered as the Duchess of Winthorpe entered. A hush rippled through the assembly, followed by a wave of murmurs. The emerald gown caught the light, jewels in her hair shimmering like dew. At her side, Nathaniel moved with quiet authority, his scars no longer a mark of pity but of power. They were a sight so striking that even the cruelest tongues hesitated. Among the crowd, Amelia saw faces she once knew, women who had turned their backs, men who had looked through her as if she were made of air. And then she saw him, Lord Thomas Pembroke, standing near the orchestra, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something colder, regret. He approached, bowing stiffly. "Your Grace," he said, voice brittle with forced civility. "London is most pleased to see you. Well." Amelia inclined her head, her composure flawless. "London," she replied, "has always had a peculiar appetite for resurrection stories." The remark drew a murmur of admiration from nearby ladies, their fans fluttering like butterflies. Thomas's face flushed, his mouth tightening. Nathaniel's hand rested lightly over hers, not possessive, but protective, and that simple gesture silenced every lingering whisper. Later, during the waltz, Nathaniel extended his hand. "One dance," he murmured, and she nodded. The music swelled, soft violins, the rhythm of memory and redemption. As they moved across the marble floor, the world blurred around them. Amelia's gown swept in graceful arcs, the emerald fabric glimmering beneath chandeliers that once bore witness to her humiliation. Nathaniel's gaze held hers, steady and sure. "Do you know what I thought when I first saw you?" he asked quietly. She smiled faintly. "That I was another problem to be managed?" He shook his head. "That you had already survived the very thing I feared most, the cruelty of others." His hand tightened around hers. "You taught me that silence is not peace, and solitude is not strength." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. "And you," she whispered, "taught me that dignity can be gentler than pride." Their steps slowed. The music softened to a tender cadence. Around them, nobles watched in spellbound silence. The Duke and Duchess of Winthrop, once broken, now whole, moved with such unity that even envy seemed a form of reverence. When the final note faded, Nathaniel leaned close enough for only her to hear. "They will never know what you endured," he said. "But I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never bear it alone again." The applause that followed felt distant, like waves crashing somewhere far away. Amelia's heart was full, her voice trembling as she answered, "Then I am no longer disgraced, only deeply loved." Nathaniel's eyes softened. He kissed her gloved hand before the assembled crowd, a gesture so simple and sincere that it silenced every last whisper. Even Thomas bowed his head, unable to meet her gaze. When the ball ended and dawn approached, Amelia stepped onto the palace terrace. The city stretched before her, its rooftops glimmering in pale light. The first birds sang above the awakening streets. Behind her, Nathaniel joined her in silence, wrapping his cloak around her shoulders. "London looks smaller than I remember," she murmured. He smiled faintly. "Or perhaps you have grown larger." The narrator's voice, soft and wise, might have spoken then, that society's cruelty was fleeting, that scandal fades but dignity endures. That sometimes the quietest revenge is simply to live beautifully. Inside, the ballroom doors closed one by one, leaving only the memory of emerald and gold, the vision of a woman once cast out now standing above the city that had scorned her. As sunlight broke through the clouds, she turned to Nathaniel. The light caught the jewels in her hair, painting her in hues of mourning. He took her hand, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "We've both been ghosts long enough," he said. She nodded, her smile radiant yet calm. "Then let us live, Your Grace, and let them remember us not for how we fell, but for how we stood." Below, the city stirred awake, unaware that its cruelest story had just rewritten itself into legend. And within that rising light, the Duchess of Winthrop, once the disgraced bride, stood as the emblem of grace London would forever envy.